long term.
Let's talk about that directly, because a lot of questions came up, unsurprisingly, about the Northern Ireland Protocol as well. Some of them along the lines of, did you underestimate the strength of feeling amongst unionist communities over what the Northern Ireland Protocol would cause, which is Northern Ireland being treated differently from the rest of the UK? Did you not think that it would be bad as it has now turned out to be?
It wasn't my agreement. Of course, it was the British government and the European Commission's agreement, and it was. I mean, I think we just have to step back a bit, because
you did argue in favour of its full implementation.
Yes, absolutely, because there's no choice.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to step back, and I'm not saying this because I want to rub anybody's nose in or anything else. I just think if you get rid of the protocol, we have to look at what the alternatives are. So remember, Boris Johnson during the referendum campaign never argued for a hard Brexit. He always said that we can keep the trading side of it. He never wanted to leave the customs union and single market. And then, of course, they've left the customs union and single market, cheered on by the DUP, which, when you think about it, is absolutely bizarre. Because once Britain leaves the customs union and single market, there have to be checks somewhere, because they're going into a different economic zone and trading relationship to the European Union. We know there's a border in Ireland with a land border with the European Union, so the border would have had to be there. That was totally unpalatable politically, but even if it wasn't, it was impractical. 20,000 British troops couldn't man that border. The idea that a few border posts would do it, and all of the implications of that. So it was always going to be the case that if Britain decided on a hard Brexit, which they have, then there would have to be checks at ports. The DUP knew this because we pointed it out to them time and time and time again. So this wasn't our...
Colum, that doesn't really... With respect, that doesn't really help, maybe somebody who feels British, is loyalist, lives in Larne or wherever they live, and is looking at the situation that has emerged. I mean, that's all well and good for pointing the finger at the DUP, but I'm just wondering...
It's genuinely not about that. I'll tell you why I say it because there's a large campaign being mounted now by unionist parties and others to scrap the protocol. But what does that mean? Where does that end? I mean, Jim Allister at least is honest about it. He said we'll put the border on the land. We'll have a hard border in Ireland. Well, that's one position. I don't think most people who are British, who feel British and are upset by this, and I understand that they're upset by this. I get that totally. But that doesn't solve their problem, because most people don't want that either, because they know there's implications to that as well. And the only way to do this was to either avoid Brexit or avoid them leaving the customs union and single market. But I also say this very clearly to people who are British and who are very worried about this and who are genuinely worried about the Good Friday Agreement. I'm not talking about the DUP in this, because they don't care about the Good Friday Agreement, and they're talking about it every day now as if they wrote it and didn't protest against it for years. But I say this genuinely to them: there is no changed constitutional position until people vote for it. Until I can convince enough people to vote for it, it doesn't change. So if you think strategically about this, unionism should not, I don't think, enter into a big debate about this, a big campaign about this, because they will lose out. And if recent history or further back history tells us anything, Boris Johnson is going to let you down. He is not going to scrap this protocol. We can fix some of the issues, some of the trading issues. We've already fixed some of them. If people calm down and work through the process, that can all be done. But we have to be honest. There are going to be changes because we're in a different trading bloc now than Britain, and that's just the reality. And so if I was the DUP, I would have used my time in power with the Tories to argue for a soft Brexit. They didn't do that, and that's where we are. So, but I totally and absolutely understand how ordinary unionists feel. I didn't want this either. We didn't want this. I want open borders right across these islands. That's the best way to trade. But this is a result. It's a practical response to a hard Brexit. There literally is no other choice once a hard Brexit is chosen.
Let me ask something before we move on. You've said that the position of Northern Ireland doesn't change unless there's obviously through consent. Why is it okay for nationalists to find a border on the island of Ireland unpalatable, but not as okay for loyalists to find a border down the Irish Sea unpalatable?
It's not about that, though. There's this kind of notion being put out there now that somebody in the European Commission decided, well, it's easier to annoy unionists than it is to annoy nationalists. It's just not the case. Let's just for 1 second park the political reality and the peace process reality about what a hard border in Ireland would do. even if you set that aside, even that wasn't an issue, who's going to man every one of the 300 plus border crossings? I mean, from a mile from here, there's probably 5. Who's going to man all of those? This isn't as if Northern Ireland is connected to the Republic of Ireland through one big bridge. I mean, this is not how this place works. Who's going to man it? Who's going to check it? Who's going to feel comfortable that the single market hasn't been infected? These are economic and trading realities that I think it's just as it is. I mean, we haven't created this problem. We'd like to fix it. We'd like to minimize it as much as possible. None of this would be an issue. If a lot of this could be resolved, by the way, tomorrow, if the British government decided to do a veterinary agreement with the European Commission. Many of the checks wouldn't have to happen in that regard, but they still are driving, and they're being supported by Sammy Wilson and the rest of them. They still are driving towards this notion, this utopian notion, that they're going to be able to go around the world and trade in very good terms. So I think that's largely been ruptured because Joe Biden is now president and all of that. But it is a bizarre approach to say we want a hard Brexit, but we also don't want checks on the border at the ports, and we also don't want a hard border. It has to be one of those three.
Okay, let me ask you one final thing before we move on to, because a lot of people have asked questions about a united Ireland as well, and I know you want to talk about that as well. Let me ask you, it's a quote from Claire Hanna. You'll know this, it's not new. Party colleague, fellow MP from just before the election. Quote, if 60% of people do not want a border on the island of Ireland and you say, tough shit, we are putting you inside a hard border, you cannot expect people to choke that down and get on with their lives. You cannot imagine that people would take that without civil disobedience at the very minimum. Now, that's not a new quote. You will have heard that before. My question is it not language like that, Colum, that has allowed loyalist paramilitaries, for example, to believe that by threatening violence, they can achieve their goal, which is to axe the NI protocol?
I don't think so, because, and I'm happy to speak to anybody about the realities of this. So on one hand, you have unionist parties saying, some of them saying we want to fix these problems, and others saying they want to scrap the protocol. Well, you can't fix and scrap something at the same time. But nobody, I would love someone, we had alternatives, by the way, to a hard border in Ireland. It was Theresa May's deal, which I would have supported. The protocol was another alternative. No Brexit, pretty good alternative. And a soft Brexit was the best way of doing this. If you wanted to have your political Brexit, if you were from that position, you could have had a political Brexit, but not a trade Brexit, but they didn't do it. So I ask all these people when they're campaigning and threatening and doing all these things, that's fine, that's their right to oppose something, but what is the actual alternative? Because you have to have one. You can't just say you want to scrap one, because that'll end up in a very unsuccessful strategy. And I think unionism should look back upon the past number of decades as to how this all ended up. Sunningdale, Anglo-Irish Agreement, the DUP opposing the Good Friday Agreement. Where did that all end up? You're better in the room, working through the process, solving the problems, making people feel comfortable, and working together. There is no alternative to partnership and all of that. And I think that's.
I get that. My question is just that has using the threat. And whether you call it a threat or you call it, what some people perceive as being a reality, that there would be civil disobedience at the border, that was part of the reason why the European Union was so keen to ensure that there was no border on the island of Ireland. My point is do you have any regrets about that language being used, because it is now legitimizing loyalist paramilitaries doing exactly the same thing in the other direction?
I think that's a big jump to say that that's legitimizing anything. I think it was a statement of fact, and there's a difference between protest, civil disobedience, and violence. And as you know, we've been opposed to violence since our inception, but we also, just to look at history, what happened on the border, over many years. So we know that would have been a very difficult thing to manage. And even if you could avoid all that, it would have even greater trade disruption than we're having right now, which I think has been exaggerated as well. But it would have been impossible to police that border in terms of checking goods. It just wasn't possible. And all of the great brains and the right wing of the Tory party and the DUP, none of them could come up with an alternative arrangement. They just couldn't come up with one that was ever going to stand up to scrutiny. So this is why we're in the situation of the protocol. We didn't want it. That's where we are. I would have much preferred no Brexit. If we had to have a Brexit, we could have had a soft Brexit. And by the way, they could still re-enter the customs union and single market if they wanted. But nobody within unionism, I now see Steve Aiken is sort of beginning to say it, but support for a veterinary agreement would solve a lot of these problems. But it won't solve the core issue around identity. And I accept that, I understand it, that we're now in a different trading relationship. I totally get that. But I don't know what to do about that, because I didn't argue for it. I argued against it, and I've tried to mitigate it ever since. And those people who argue for it have to own it. And the best way to do that is not to wind people up and tell them there's a solution at the other end of this. And I think a lot of this is driven by the DUP's guilty conscience, because they got us into this mess. But they shouldn't be lying to their own people and saying this can be solved. There will be difference. There will be new supply chains. All of that will happen. Okay. We can resolve as many of these issues as possible, but the best thing to do is sit down, work together. I don't ever remember in the history of the North of Ireland there being another solution other than sitting down and talking to each other.
Okay. Yes. We actually, you mentioned Ian Blackford earlier. We had Ian Blackford to chat, and we asked him about a potential border between Scotland and England. And he said that in Northern Ireland, more attention should have been given to the idea of technology at the border, because that solution could then be used between Scotland and England, which I'm sure is something that some people will want to look into. I want to